Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes as we wait for the room to fill. So just hang back. We'll get started shortly. We'll get started about 12:03. Welcome, everyone, to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in a couple of minutes, around 12:03 as we let the room fill in. I'll keep repeating it a couple of times, but just hang tight. We'll get started shortly. Welcome, everyone, to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. I hope y'all can hear and see me. We'll get started in a couple of minutes as we wait for the room to fill, just 1 or 2 more minutes. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So just thank you, everyone, for joining our Intro to Tech Equity webinar. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. And in my role, I get to engage with our supporters and our members through volunteer opportunities, through some of the campaigns we participate in, events, and now I get to engage with you all on this webinar. So feel free to drop in any questions into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens as we go. But we won't answer any questions until the end. We'll also be sending out a follow-up email after the presentation with a link to the recording and a link to the slides. So you'll have all that in your inboxes shortly. So a little bit about what we'll be covering today. We'll talk about why TechEquity exists as an organization and how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address our most pressing economic issues. But first, let's talk about why we're here. Well, TechEquity got started because some of its earliest founders and members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their own neighborhoods. And they understood that there was this perception that tech and tech workers were causing these problems. So they noticed things like rising rents, displacement, traffic, and increases in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they as tech workers were uniquely positioned to help contribute to some solutions to address these issues. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that this affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. Many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. And at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed by everything that's going on. So as a result, the pandemic has this potential to further exacerbate inequality that our region was already experiencing. Because of our affordability crisis, communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, growing up in the Bay Area my whole life, I've been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities, what that means for them, for their homes, for their families. But I also have friends and family who have pursued jobs within tech and have been able to, become very successful for themselves and for their families alike. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that's further dividing communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide within our region. And while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal caused by the pandemic, it's important to note that Many within the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed. More than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to help support our neighbors, but it's hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty. So this is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area. I think the fact that rents are rising isn't really a surprise to anyone on this call because we all know this, we feel this, we've heard this from our friends and family. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants has actually decreased slightly. So we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based as an organization, and it's where tech is headquartered, but a version of this story is playing out all across the country. And it really is a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success. And without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated, like we just talked about. Before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around 4%, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims spiked 16%, which is a more dramatic spike than our last recession in 2008. So in the span of 1 month, we lost a decade's worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. At TechEquity Collaborative, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it won't happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities. We have to show up, and we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. We believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to issues where they live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this, and the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar today and getting to learn a little bit more about us and about equity issues in California. One second here. How we work. So our goal is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. So we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. So we help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in systems change in 3 major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live. And we do this in a variety of ways. We host book club discussions, panel discussions with experts, webinars such as these, voter guides around election seasons, just a bunch of different ways to educate folks. We advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. So a perfect example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which TechEquity, along with other coalition members, community-based organizations, and legislators work together to help pass this law, which now extends protections to 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice aiming to turn companies into agents of change and agents of equity in the broader community through our corporate partnerships and engagements with companies. As we've talked about, tech workers have outsized political power that's largely untapped when it comes to public policy advocacy. So connecting tech workers to outside perspectives builds empathy and ethical practices in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. At TechEquity Collaborative, our 2 issue areas are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of this, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in many ways, because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, and we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. So while the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed within our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our own neighborhoods. As I said, the affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices we've made over the course of decades have set us up for this level of pain our community is feeling, especially now during the pandemic. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area and California and all across the country, and that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And this policy is so named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. So those are those red squares you see on the map of San Francisco. And those communities that were deemed risky for investment didn't receive any investment at all. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. In other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy, and it made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often the communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. The crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. It extends all across California and all across the country. So these are examples of redlined neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta. And once again, it's those red blocks you see in both maps. Those are neighborhoods that have been historically redlined. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from accessing this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived in redlined neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock, like a global pandemic, for example, a huge rent increase, a sudden loss of a job, your car breaks down, things like that. And it impacts almost 1 out of 2 Californians. So 46% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates. So 67% of Latino households are in liquid asset poverty, and 63% of African American households are in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening, but as we've talked about, many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. The twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing, and wages that don't cover the cost of living have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcomes of the pandemic. Many people in our communities were already struggling. And as the pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and unequal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions. As we can see, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. So according to the Economic Policy Institute, the state of workers covered by collective bargaining agreement unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. So this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. And while all workers have lost out because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. While there's a wage gap between worker pay and productivity, like we just talked about, there's also a pay gap between race. So white men are earning more cents to the dollar. It's that orange bar on the left side of your screen in comparison to Black men and women, which are the two blue bars on the right side of your screen. So because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less, and disproportionately, they're not able to afford living in cities that provide good jobs. So the cost of living here were already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford an average 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So if you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average 2-bedroom working a normal, regular 8-hour day, right? However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom. Once again, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford a 2-bedroom. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up an impossible situation for low wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work in. And this problem persists all across the country. So even though the costs in burgeoning tech cities like Austin, Denver, and Atlanta aren't as high, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone earning minimum wage. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making 6 figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or in marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of a wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, and cooks who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford that apartment. But why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us what we should be building. The state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job of meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing. So that's that big blue bar on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable for people making that good salary we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. Those are the two left red bars on the left side of your screen. And as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities while folks with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, those are those orange bars on the left side, have left San Francisco at higher rates, while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% AMI are in a more drastic situation where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco and they're being pushed into homelessness or worse. So that's why that last blue bar is actually increasing. There is not enough affordable housing available to help support the most vulnerable members in our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are even more tragic. As we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are living in liquid asset poverty at higher rates. And furthermore, Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years. A combination of discriminatory housing laws, low wages, and a lack of affordable housing production has created a crisis of displacement. So displacement isn't driven by policy choices, and we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. And the folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are getting hit the hardest by this crisis. And we know that we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. The good news is that members at TechEquity Collaborative are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. And together we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. And we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So as you see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is a result of years and years of bad policy choices. The good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. At TechEquity Collaborative, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve this without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis. And it starts with production. So building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability, like we just talked about. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build. Preservation. We need to make sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. Protection. We need to protect existing tenants from displacement. It's going to take a long time to build the housing that we need, but in the meantime, we need to make sure that tenants are protected from displacement. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially in housing. And that means we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we need to be thinking about short and long-term solutions to preservation and protection, because as we've talked about, many of our neighbors are more at risk than ever as a result of the pandemic. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. And we want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role they're in. So we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see that there are large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse, and contracted employees. And in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we've created a standard that tech companies should implement for contracted workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, making sure the workplace is safe, and ensuring that there's fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. Training as a standalone approach will not lead us out of inequality and not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. So in order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards, and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. Last, we need to make sure everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. And we must strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So as we've talked about, there are tons of ways in which you can get involved. We host tons of educational events, so keep an eye on future events that our organization is holding. If you're interested in public policy, you can check out our priority legislation that we are organizing our membership around, including rental registry, extending paid family leave, and more. So we'll have more information in the next slides, or you can email me after. In the follow-up for corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get involved on these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So like I said, you can reply to that follow-up email and we'll connect you with our corporate partnerships manager. So this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in while building community in the process. This year, we're excited to continue our work in housing and labor spaces through creating ethical work practices in tech, tackling algorithmic bias in housing that further drives inequality and upholds a systemic racism in the housing market, and crucial housing policies that are protecting and bringing relief to our most vulnerable communities. So what can you do today? Well, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work. You can support us financially by becoming a member for $10 a month, or you can take action by supporting a rental registry or other party legislation, which I'll be talking about next. So as I talked about, TechEquity is committed to getting better data about our housing market. And better data means that we can build more accurate policy interventions and ensure that help is being targeted to people who need it the most. So TechEquity is working on a number of campaigns to get better data on housing and ensure that the data is being used fairly through our rental registry and algorithmic bias in housing initiatives. So this year we ran a bill, AB 1188, that unfortunately stalled out in the legislative process this year, but we plan to continue to pursue establishing a rent registry and make sure you subscribe to our newsletter, join our Slack so that you can stay up to date on our progress with this initiative. You can also take action on various other pieces of legislation that relate to our core issues of housing, the workforce, and labor. So we've decided to focus our advocacy on these bills because they will do the most to ensure an affordable home, a family-sustaining job, and a true safety net are available to all Californians. And if you'd like more information on these bills, we'll be including links to the page on the follow-up email, so you'll get more information and how you can help support these. And as I mentioned, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work, you can become a member of TechEquity for $10 a month, or you can take action with us. If you're confused, you can also in the follow-up email, I can answer any questions you have, or if you want a specific volunteer opportunity, feel free to reach out to me. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. So if you have any questions, I'll be taking questions in the Q&A. Like I said earlier, we have a follow-up email going out after this, so you can also ask your questions afterwards. Just give it a couple of seconds, see if any questions come in. Cool. Not seeing any questions. That's perfectly fine. I want to thank you all for your time today. We hope that you feel inspired to join our growing movement. As I mentioned, if you want to volunteer opportunity, become a member, join an event, and you're still a little bit unsure, feel free to email me. Thank you, everyone. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll hope to see you soon.